Hey there everybody, and welcome back. In today's video I'm going to be covering the basics of how to walk over any recent car audio upgrades, specifically installation of subwoofers. So if you've had this work done and maybe the system doesn't sound the way that it should, or you're concerned that maybe the install wasn't a quality installation using quality parts, stay tuned. I'm going to be covering a couple of quick tips that you can use to double check over this installation in this video. Now before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out the channel for new content. So I've been blessed with a beautiful day today, so I'm going to go ahead and jump straight in. I have two 10-inch Memphis Street Edge subwoofers that I bought on Craigslist. Got a pretty good deal on these and this amp. If you want me to cover how to actually get this installed, check out the links in the description. I'll go over that as well. But today I'm going to be rating this install. So I took it to a shop, had this installed, tried to find a cheaper one. There aren't many in my area, so I ended up paying about $270 with tax. So we're going to start the install from the front under the hood. Basically, first thing and probably most crucial is the power cord. If they use the wrong wiring, for example, if they use wiring that's too small or not high quality wiring, this could end up melting when you're pulling a ton of power through it, causing shorts and all kinds of damage and problems. So I provided a 4-gauge Stinger wiring kit, which is more than enough for what I needed. So we're going to cover this. Now, I actually swapped out this wire, so if you notice it's two different colors, that's actually on me. But we're going to cover the first issue that I noticed and one thing you should look for. So you'll see we have this hooked up to the power, to the positive terminal on our battery. Everything looks like it's installed, as correctly as can be. The concern that I had is this fuse holder, which if you don't have one should already be a cause for concern because obviously you're dealing with the electrical components of the vehicle. But this was a bit of a concern for me, is this cord right here was about 2 to 3 inches long, which left this fuse holder basically hanging over down here off the side. So what I did to correct this is I had a little bit of extra 4-gauge wire. So I took this 4-gauge wire, cut it, and then I swapped it out. And then I was able to move this fuse holder over here. Instead of drilling it into the fuse box, I used some really strong 3M adhesive tape. That way this isn't going to fly off while I'm driving. And I tried to keep the cables out of the way of any moving parts or anything that would get very, very hot. So you're trying to keep this away from the heat from the engine or any other moving parts, because anything that could potentially cut this over time could cause shorts and all kinds of other issues. So you want to make sure that your power wire is actually running the way that it should. So that's already something kind of dinging against the individuals that installed this. It's a really easy way to just run it and attach it to the top of the fuse box. I worked with another audio shop where I shadowed and saw them do this, which works really well for me. And adding an extra couple inches of power wire makes no difference to the audio as far as I can tell. So that's first thing to look for is there a fuse holder set up? Is the fuse the right fuse for what you're using? Is the power wire run correctly? The next thing to look for, which may require you to take the battery out of the vehicle, which you should be doing if you're actually working with anything anyway, is looking at how this wire's run through the firewall of the car. So some shops will actually drill a hole and run it through and put a grommet in. That's one thing you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to. So the firewall of the car is actually blocking out, any of the harmful fumes from the engine, and it's also keeping the noise out. So what we're going to do to make sure that things are run through correctly, we are going to go through. I will turn on the flashlight, and we are going to look at where the power wire is coming through the firewall of the car. So if we move this little piece of sound insulation here, you'll see that I've already added in some sound dampening material, so it didn't originally look like that. But I had another issue with how they handled this. So I got in the car, and I just heard this really loud engine noise that I hadn't heard previously. And I found out that this grommet here, that's actually holding all of these wires in, was pushed through the other side. So basically they just shoved it through, and all these wires were just kind of hanging here. And there's this giant gap through the firewall of the car where the power cord came through. So I was hearing a ton of engine noise. So you have a couple of choices when you're handling this. So if you have a manual car, most cars in the firewall will actually have options where the clutch would come through that you could drill a hole. You just need to be careful and make sure that you're doing that safely and you're not puncturing anything and also not causing any rust. And that you have a grommet to essentially handle the new wire going through. But the other option, some people will drill a hole through the current grommet. So what I did, so I didn't have to pull the wire out, is I cut into the existing grommet here, and then I just fed the power wire through, and I pulled the grommet back to seal up where it should be. So if you look underneath your car, you should be able, or underneath the driver's side seat, where the firewall of the car is, you should be able to see right here where you have a grommet with a ton of wires coming through, and you should be able to feed your power wire through that. So I pulled the grommet, put this here, and basically ran the power wire through that, and then just sealed it up a little bit more with some sound dampening material. Sounds way better than it did when I actually left the shop. And then we will see what they did with these wires. So they ran the power wire. You basically just pull up these pieces here. They ran the power wire, basically pretty standard setup. They just ran it straight down the side of the car, feed it right under the back seat, and hooked it up to the amp. So that's the power wire, nothing big there. I'm not a huge fan of how they handled that at all. So now let's go to the remote turn on. This is where we get borderline dangerous with how this was handled. So I will turn the flashlight off. You'll see the remote turn on wire, which is how your amp knows when to shut on or off. That way you're not always pulling power, is literally just shoved into where this fuse is. So the fuse is halfway in. Let's see, add the flashlight again. So you'll see the fuse is pushed out a little bit, and then this wire is literally just shoved in with the fuse. So there are add-a-fuse systems that are very cheap, and you can pull the fuse out, stick it into this thing, and add your additional fuse or wire to it, which is a much more efficient way. I'll give them credit for creativity, but this is not a clean way to do it at all, and in my opinion, not safe. The fuse should not be hanging out halfway, nor should the wire just be shoved in like that. So this wire is feeding through here, and feeds and follows the exact same course as the power wire. So it just runs under here, goes through here. So the reason I'm critiquing the remote turn on is you want to have clean setup for anything that is going to be carrying power, mainly for safety reasons. So we're not even talking about audio quality, which is a factor, but you want to make sure that your wires are run safely so that you're not actually risking short-circuiting any of the components, not only in your audio system, but in the car. And if they're using the wrong or low-quality wire, if that wire melts and it's touching other wires, it can actually cause damage to the carpet or the electrical system. So just another thing to consider. So the power and remote turn on, in my opinion, were not handled very well at all. At least the power wire was hooked up relatively well. I mean, overall, I'm just really not happy with the remote turn on. So those are two things to look at first. Are your cables managed properly? And is anything pinching them? Are they bent? Is there any cuts in the cables that could cause a short circuit? So nothing serious so far. So everything's looking decent, very easy to clean up if you get the right equipment. So that's been taken care of. Now we're going to look at the speaker wires. So these were actually set up by the individual I purchased this vehicle from. So it's pretty standard. We have our speaker wire running straight to the subwoofers. Nothing to note there. That's perfectly fine. So the last thing to check from the shop is the ground and how they actually pulled the speaker wire. So in a CX-5, you can actually pull this piece up right here. And you'll see we have the speaker wire right down here. We're using this little converter. So the speaker wire was pulled from another area of the car, and we'll get this flashlight turned back on. So you'll see we have this little converter. So if we grab this little bundle of wires, we have the speaker wire running into this converter. I'll move this over so you can see it. And then we have the RCA cables right here going from the speaker wire converter to the amp, which is actually feeding in on this side over here. So that looks to be done relatively well. There's not much you can mess up there, to be honest. Again, you're just pulling from existing speaker wires and doing what you can. Again, you want to make sure that you're pulling from the right type of speaker wire. You don't want to pull from speakers that are predominantly high frequency speakers. Then the last thing we're going to look at is the ground, because really that's the last input for this system. So this is another one. It's just a very, very messy setup, in my opinion. So what they did was they pulled the back of the seat and they actually used an aluminum brush to get rid of the paint, which is good, they did that. But they mounted this to the seat itself and not to the chassis. So I typically prefer to ground to the chassis itself, whether you need to drill a hole or not. But they could have easily tried to ground this to where the seats bolt into the chassis, and just to get a more secure ground. And it just, again, you want to try to get the ground as short and as stable as possible, so grounding to the chassis is a great choice. I'll give them credit, the wire is relatively short, which is a good thing, but again, I would have grounded to the chassis. The other concern I have here is, as you can see, my seats are moved forward, so over time this ground is going to be moved around a lot. That's not good for that wire. It's going to be tearing the little individual copper pieces off the wire and bending it and potentially breaking it at some point. I don't think that it's a huge deal, but I really just think that this could have been handled much better. So in summary, the things that you're going to want to look for when you're going over your installation: make sure that your power wire is run correctly. It's not bent or sliced or cut. Make sure it's the right size wire for the wattage that you're running. Make sure it's a high quality wire. Make sure that your ground is ground to the chassis if and when possible, and that basically that you've cleared off any paint so that it's metal on metal contact. You're going to want to make sure, if you're using an RCA converter, that your wires are crimped off correctly. You're going to want to make sure that everything, any visible or exposed wire, is properly handled. So you want to make sure that you're using electrical tape or any kind of material that will seal those off. You're going to want to make sure that the wires are not in a high traffic area that's easily visible. So if these seats move up and back frequently, you don't want the wires to get caught up in that. And then lastly, you're going to want to make sure that if you're using any kind of RCA converter, that box is not dangling and pulling on the wires too much. So in essence, follow the leads to every wire from this amp throughout the car. Make sure that everything looks good and is secured and managed properly. So this overall install, I would give it honestly a 5 out of 10. I don't think that I would rate it much higher than that, because it looks like they took a lot of shortcuts. But I'd love to know your thoughts. How do you think they did? Drop a comment below, and I'll see you all in the next video.